Good afternoon. I'm Barbara Gross, Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the third of our lectures in the Institute's Dean's Lecture Series this year. That series brings to the Harvard community leading artists and scholars in the humanities, the sciences, and the social sciences to speak about their innovative work, enabling the larger community to learn about and share in the excitement of scholarship at the frontiers of knowledge. Just an aside to let you know that the fourth and final lecture in this series will be quite close to this one. On Monday, April 4th, Kara Mertes, director of the Sundance Institute's documentary film program, will be here to speak, and I hope you'll come back and join us for that as well. But to today's lecture. It's a wonderful delight for me not only to host these lectures, but also to have an opportunity to let all of you meet some of Radcliffe Institute's academic ventures faculty leaders. And with that in mind, I'm very happy to introduce Leah Price, who is Senior Advisor to the Humanities Program at the Institute. Leah is a professor of English and a Harvard College professor in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Her research focuses on 18th and 19th century culture, narrative theory, gender, and the history of reading. She's also the person who introduced me to Dame Beer's fascinating work. Leah.
Thank you, Barbara. Curiouser and curiouser, exclaims Alice as she falls down the rabbit hole at the beginning of Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. Over the course of Dame Gillian Beer's dozen-plus books, we can see the mind of a critic becoming curiouser and curiouser. Curious about evolutionary biology, curious about quantum physics, curious about non-Euclidean geometry, never afraid to leave the known domestic terrain of literary criticism to plunge down new rabbit holes and to discover new universes. Professor Beer's 1983 book, Darwin's Plots, is one of those books that really invented an entire field that now seems so known and so natural that it's hard for us to believe that there was ever a time when it did not exist. He did so in part by casting Darwin as a scientist who is also a creative artist, a gifted literary stylist whose language allows the reader, in Beer's words, to participate in a copious world, a voyage into the past as exuberant as his voyage around the world in the Beagle. Beer's own many voyages bridge what C.P. Snow called the two cultures of literature and science, at the same time as they consistently reflect on the history of that distinction, on the changing ways in which novelists and scientists have understood, or often even more productively misunderstood, one another's ideas and one another's languages. The title of her 1996 book, Open Fields, Science and Cultural Encounter, evokes Beer's commitment to opening discourses and disciplines that have too often been hermetically walled off from one another. Her recent work as a public intellectual and advocate for the arts, among other things as a judge of the Orange Prize and the chair of the Booker Prize Committee, testifies to a different kind of openness, one that engages with the future as well as the past of the novel. Dame Gillian Beer is King Edward VII Professor of English Literature Emerita at Cambridge University, where she is also a Life Fellow of Girton College and the former president of Clare Hall. Her current project places Lewis Carroll's Alice books in dialogue with 19th century intellectual controversies. And her talk today, which is taken from that project, is entitled simply Alice in Time. Please welcome her to Radcliffe.
Thank you. Well, it is a great pleasure to be here. I felt at that moment that perhaps we were going to have an Alician experience with everything going backwards through the frames. But here we are at the start of something I want to discuss with you afterwards. I hope there'll be a chance for people to engage in questions and comments and so on at the end. That is the way the Alice books have travelled through time and the way they're embedded in time. They're a rather an extraordinary example, in fact, of what you might call the sort of the flying 19th century, still active in 2011. The vocabulary of the books has leapt across right into the 21st century, bringing portmanteau words and unburstes, and, as Leah's already mentioned, things curiouser and curiouser. Then there's now Alice in Wonderland syndrome in psychiatry, with its symptoms of macrospia and microspia, which means apparently the perception in which things seem larger or smaller or far away and extremely close at once. Parts of animals, persons and objects bulge or wither. And there are touchstone references all around us in advertisements, graphic novels, video games, and Derrida. Last year there was Tim Burton's film sequel, and this year, 2011, in Britain, there are 2 new ballets, which in one sense is the opposite of what you would expect for Alice in Wonderland, which is so extremely verbal a text. But there's a wonderful one at Covent Garden and another one happening further north, and there's going to be an Alice Festival and a major exhibition later in the year at Tate Liverpool. Now, I think this is really rather remarkable because we're so used to texts being remembered for their centenaries. And in fact, it won't be till 2015 that the publication, 150-year publication date of Alice in Wonderland occurs. So people are getting primed already. Lord knows what's going to happen in 2015. I am always interested by what it is about these books that continues to grip readers and viewers. And among the several possible answers to that, I'm going to concentrate here on time and its troubling. I'll place the books to some degree in their own time and in relation to some of the issues, practical and theoretical, concerning temporality that were then anxious and current. And then from that, I think will emerge some collusions, some collisions with our own preoccupations. And I'll end by reflecting on what's permanent, or perhaps it's better to say what's permanently renewed in our experience of time. Lewis Carroll was also Charles Dodson, mathematician, and he was inevitably aware of the disturbing arguments that seemed then newly to suggest that our view of space and time within the Euclidean order is local, not universal. As Dodson, Lewis Carroll was a devout Euclidean. As Lewis Carroll, Dodson stepped across those boundaries. In an 1891 letter to Mrs. Liddell, mother of the original Alice, Alice Liddell, once his adversary, now cautiously his friend again, 25 years after the publication of Alice in Wonderland and nearly 20 after Through the Looking Glass, Carroll, or Dodson, muses on the condensations and stayings of time, I quote. "It seems but yesterday when the Dean and you first arrived. Yet I was hardly more than a boy then, and many of the pleasantest memories of those early years, that foolish time that seemed as if it would last forever, are bound up with the names of yourself and your children. Time returns in his memory as timelessness, that foolish time that seemed as if it would last forever. But timelessness is delusive. Carroll continues the sentence, and now I am an old man, already beginning to feel a little weary of life. The Liddles are retiring after 36 years at Christ Church, and he's grown from boy to old man. He was 59 years old. Yet that distant time, as he puts it, that seemed as if it would last forever also seems but yesterday. These are the ordinary and the profound experiences of time passing common across centuries. Time's vagaries in memory move slantwise in waves, not in a receding line. And Lewis Carroll dipped into childhood games anew whenever he was with children. He entered the entertainment as child and organizing adult at once. Multiple times of life rippled through each other in such moments. Something of the same double capacity marks the Alice books, so intimately lodged alongside the experience of the child reader, who is a child in the books of 7, so just having learnt to read, that profound acculturation that takes place as we learn to read. And at the same time, the adult reader enjoying the frisson of re-entering child experience with adult awareness. But the collusion between adult reader and narrator never outwits the nonchalant friendship between Alice and the words that carry her story. Alice herself is confident in her occasional role as instructive adult as well as that of inquiring child. She doesn't observe the time boundaries marked by adults usually between adult experience and childhood innocence. She wants to know and she wants to dispose. Thresholds may daunt her, but she crosses them. So I start with this time-mingled experience of Dodson himself because time in the Alice books is a fraught matter. They're preoccupied with time, of course, since their author was not only a mathematician, but a logician, and temporality is fundamental both to logic and to possible worlds. Wonderland is preceded by Tenniel's image of the dapper white rabbit, who I hope's there. Yes, there he is, earnestly consulting his watch. When you open the book, that's the first thing you see. It's the watch that startles Alice. A rabbit with pink eyes runs past her, and then we're told, and I've shortened this sentence, which is a wonderfully long one, there was nothing so very remarkable in that, nor did Alice think it so very much out of the way to hear the rabbit say to itself, oh dear, I shall be too late. But when the rabbit actually took, and he underlines this, a watch out of its waistcoat pocket and looked at it and then hurried on, Alice started to her feet, for it flashed across her mind that she had never before seen a rabbit with either a waistcoat pocket or a watch to take out of it. And burning with curiosity, she ran across the field after it. Curiosity, the core feeling of Alice. It's hard, I think, to extract parts of this long sentence because it races on from description into narrative. It's a sentence that propels us as readers to the brink of the hole that drops to Wonderland. Belatedness, anxiety, physical props like the watch, all bespeak the individual under the cosh of time-regulated society. The rabbit is an animal that speaks, but that's not what the child finds remarkable. It's the accoutrements of adult business, busyness. And this is no Palian watch, abandoned in a field to prompt thoughts of the maker behind the manufactured object and offer assurance that God's design is implied. Quite the contrary. This is a watch out of kilter, challenging human exceptionalism. The watch usually signifies the particularly human capacity to invent complex technology. H.R.A. Waldron, for instance, has pointed out that a neighbour of Lewis Carroll's in Oxford was also an inventor, and one of the things he invented was an alarm clock which woke the sleeper by tipping him out of his bed. This was exhibited at Crystal Palace in 1851. But then why shouldn't rabbits have watches? There may be reasons why. But here we encounter one rabbit who does have a watch and who can read it, and that sets off the whole sequence of Alice's adventures. watches were established already as the token of human respectability and worth, by the time Lewis Carroll was writing the Alice books. And of course, that odd custom of, I don't know whether it's prevalent here still, but in Britain until very recently, the custom of giving a long-term worker a watch when he or she retired, when presumably they wouldn't need it so urgently, has prevailed. Though it was suggested to me, and I think this is a rather nice suggestion, that perhaps the symbolism is that the worker is now given his own time back for himself, so he gets the watch to go with it. Along with the factory clock, watches were also the instruments that controlled industrialized labor. There were, as has indeed been much studied, for instance, by Wolfgang Schivelbusch and David Landis, a great many new technologies of regularized time in the early 19th century and during the period of Lewis Carroll's life and writing. The Alice books, 1865, 1872, appeared when railways and their timetables had newly required the regularizing of time across the whole of the country. It had not been so regularized before. And Dan Falk, in Search of Time, quotes a very nice explanatory note that he gleaned from the Great Western Railway timetable in 1841, which to me sounds a bit like a passage from Alice itself. This is it. London time is kept at all stations on the railway, which is about 4 minutes earlier than Reading time, 5.5 minutes before Stevenson time, 7.5 minutes before Cirencester time, 8 minutes before Chippenham time, and 14 minutes before Bridgewater time. And one of Lewis Carroll's own earliest extended inventions, composed around 1850, was a comic operetta for marionette theatre called La Guida di Bradja, Bradshaw's Guide, the Bible of all train timetables, the new authority. And the personified guide in Carroll's little play, in obscure revenge, has changed all the train times in secret so that the characters have been left in the lurch too late for departed trains, and comic mayhem ensues. And I'm sure you'll remember how there are these train incidents, one in particular, of course, in the Alice books. There's also a good deal of train joking in his poems. Space and time, then, at the time that he was writing, were coming to be understood more and more as being in intricate relations. Chronometers kept time at sea and helped in the mapping of colonial claims, bringing time and space together. The new technology of the photograph, of which Lewis Carroll was an early adept, froze and made portable a moment and a place. It also demanded long and rigid passivity from its subjects. There's a whole wealth of work on Lewis Carroll as photographer. This afternoon I'm not going to talk about that very much, but just to be aware of the degree to which his work as a photographer is all the time making him aware of inversion, for instance. And there are some extremely funny cartoons, both in Punch and elsewhere, of the paraphernalia of being a photographer, where you vanish like a monster. So you have these hybrid creatures, which are half prop, half cloak, and then a bit of man sticking out at the back, and usually they have a bull coming up behind. So there are a lot of jokes about exactly the photographer as a frozen object, and yet as somebody who makes things portable. And as Jimena Canales has recently pointed out, 1/10 of a second was a newly significant time unit at that time, particularly in measuring the speed of the nervous system. As so often, Hermann von Helmholtz was in the van of such new discoveries in the 1850s and on, working particularly on reaction time. He also summarized in a very interesting Academy article in 1870 many of the non-Euclidean insights that had been gathering during the 1850s and 1860s, most powerfully expressed by W.K. Clifford and by Cayley. Helmholtz ends this essay, which he calls On the Axioms of Geometry. It's actually a translation of a much longer, more portentous essay, which he'd published already in German. But here he does it in a popular style, and he ends by citing Riemann's, as Helmholtz puts it, somewhat startling conclusion that the axioms of Euclid may be perhaps only approximately true. Much of his essay demonstrates the logical congruity of conceiving intelligent beings living on ellipsoids, on what he calls pseudospherical surfaces, in 2 dimensions, in 4, and he concludes by pointing out that the axioms on which our geometrical system is based are no necessary truths, rather they are the scientific expression of a most general fact of experience, the fact, namely, that in our space, bodies can move freely without altering their form. Not entirely what Alice experiences as she sways on an elongated neck in the canopy of a tree, or is crushed into the space of the rabbit's house. Or, yes, there she is at her most claustrophobic, poor woman. And as you see, Tenniel was very apt, the illustrator, at taking up all these new figurations of the body for Alice. I'll come back to that at the end. So regularizing time and defining ever smaller units were contemporary practices that chime with the age-old as well as the up-to-date time anxieties in Alice. The Duchess, oh, won't she be savage if I've kept her waiting? But industrial, scientific, and technological changes are not the only markers of temporality in these books. Sundials, solar time, dreams and tenses each add their diverse calculations and processes, and very often these are clashing against each other. Yes, now that's another Alice arm, as you see. That's Salvador Dali's, one of his illustrations for Alice. And then there we have the sundials, who don't really figure in the text, but they're introduced because they're also, it's the whole helix of these curious creatures that fascinates him. So our daytime timekeeping, it turns out, is not the only possible way of experiencing the chronic, that is, time in its extension. These wayward, non-causal sequences, such as those experienced in Dream, nudge the episodes onward in both Alice books. And Dream shares with narrative the property of presenting experience as at once past and yet in process now. There's a book, an 1847 book, in Lewis Carroll's library by the physician George Moore, which dwells on just that quality of dream experience. Moore writes, "During the interval between the evening and morning, what intricate visions of activity and interest, all according to some important law of our being, crowd upon the busy soul, not indeed in the distinctness of a measured and material succession, but if at once past and yet present. The temporal becomes spatial, with perspectives dissolved between past and present, all in the foreground and yet receding too." Moore goes on, he argues, there's no consciousness of time in our dreams, for a sense of time arises from a comparison of the relative duration of material changes, and therefore belongs only to the outward use of the mind. I puzzled over this quite a lot. I think perhaps what he means is that it's impossible to recollect the length of time that a dream takes to dream. It may seem endless and capable of unrolling aeons, and yet flash past in a kind of retrospective, waking, dreaming moment. It's certainly not the case in the Alice books that consciousness of time is obliterated. On the contrary, the anxiety of both books is propelled by a sense of haste and crowding. Off with their heads is the Red Queen's peremptory solution to any delay at all. And G.H. Lewis, another writer whom Carroll much admired, described the effect of time in dreams more poetically in a book that we know Carroll was reading just at the time that he was writing Alice in Wonderland, Physiology of Common Life. He describes it there in terms of propulsion and arrest. This is Lewis. And because in dreams, says Lewis, as in reverie, we do not pause on certain suggestions, do not recur to them and reflect on them, but let one rapidly succeed another like shadows chasing each other over a cornfield, we take little or no heed of any incongruities. It's constantly said that in dreams nothing surprises us. I think, he argues, this is a mistake. Nothing arrests us, but every incongruity surprises us. The dreaming reader and the watchful Alice share this consciousness of incongruity, but it never halts her passage. There we have the Red King getting away from the Red Queen into his dreams. And of course, it is only in waking that dreams become incoherent, while in process, I think there is not a sense of incoherence, but simply of streaming. But though dream is one kind of time order in the Alice books, both books also explore something rather different, which is the expansion and intricacy that games discover in time, whether the game be croquet or chess. Games intricate process, and much of their enjoyment lies in just that process of intrication. But they also have a goal, and therefore a control. And in the Looking Glass world, Alice does eventually become a queen when, as a pawn, she reaches the end of the board. But that purposiveness is also inverted by the temporal order of things behind the Looking Glass, where people are imprisoned before they commit a crime, the queen screams before she pricks herself, and to approach things, one must walk away, and to stay in one place, you must run very fast indeed. There she is. There they are, in flight, almost literally in flight, as you see, because the queen is pulling Alice along so fast. Well, in our country, said Alice, still panting a little, you'd certainly get somewhere else if you ran very fast for a long time, as we've been doing. A slow sort of country, said the Queen. Now here, you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that. So we become the slow sort of country. Now, Carol seems first to have conceived through the Looking Glass on the plane of a chessboard, a homoloid, and then later to have added imaginatively the optical reversing effects of the mirror. Put together, they give rise to a conundrum that we can recognize from a number of mathematicians of the time, and particularly his friend J.J. Sylvester, who, in his presidential address to the mathematical section of the 1866 British Association for the Advancement of Science, claimed this: "The laws of motion," he says, "prove in a general way that the space we live in is a flat or level space, a homoloid, our existence therein being assimilable to the life of a bookworm on a flat page. But what if the page were undergoing a process of gradual bending into a curved form?" Mr. W.K. Clifford has indulged in some remarkable speculations as to the possibility of our being able to infer from certain unexplained phenomena of light and magnetism the fact of our level space of 3 dimensions being in the act of undergoing in space of 4 dimensions, space is inconceivable to us as our space is to the bookworm, a distortion analogous to the rumpling of the page. Now, Sylvester published an extended version of this pamphlet, intriguingly, in a book of his called The Laws of Verse and the Principles of Versification Exemplified in Metrical Translation. My point there is simply that poetry, the metrics of poetry and the metrics of maths, were lying quite close together in people's imagination, in mathematicians' imaginations at that time. And the tone of Sylvester's address, as of course of Lewis Carroll's poetry, is spry, emphasizing, and this is what Sylvester writes, the need to quicken the mind of the student, of mathematics particularly, by familiarizing him with what he calls the doctrine of the imaginary and the inconceivable. Play was important in the mathematical discovery of Carroll's time. Carroll was not, as it were, averse from his co-mathematicians in emphasizing play, extremes, the inconceivable, the imaginary. But of course, by placing the flat chessboard and the curved optics of the looking glass together, he can suggest a newly equivocal understanding of how time and space may be rumpled. In Looking Glass particularly, Alice becomes aware that our diurnal mode of living in time is just a peculiar set, not necessarily the only pattern available. A thicker arrangement can be conceived. The White Queen recalls, "We had such a thunderstorm last Tuesday. I mean, one of the last sets of Tuesdays, you know." Alice was puzzled. "In our country," she remarked, "there's only one day at a time." The Red Queen said, "That's a poor thin way of doing things. Now here, we mostly have days and nights 2 or 3 at a time, and sometimes in winter we take as many as 5 nights together, for warmth, you know." This merging and crossing between different modalities of time, I think, helps to explain the attraction of Alice for the surrealists. Darley's brilliant illustrations pithily express the dream time of Alice. They persistently show the child leaping and dancing. She's often just a tiny figure somewhere down in a corner. Yes, that one has her very prominent, but very often she's just down in a corner, and what's striking is that her shifting shadow is always at just slightly the wrong angle to the sun. In Wonderland, Alice unwarily shows off her knowledge of the Earth circling round the sun. "If everybody minded their own business," the Duchess said in a hoarse growl, "this world would go round a deal faster than it does." "Which would not be an advantage," said Alice, who felt very glad to get an opportunity of showing off a little of her knowledge. "Just think what work it would make with the day and night. You see, the Earth takes 24 hours to turn round on its axis." "Talking of axes," said the Duchess, "chop off her head." The oral trumps the written. Indeed, throughout the 2 books, tension is maintained between the oral, which is voiced now, in the present, in a particular place, and the written, which always includes retrospect and may be carried anywhere. Dialogue is the premium medium of discourse in both books, dialogue which foregrounds the oral, springing back out of the written into the present of encounter. And Carroll also notates the commentary as if it were a speaking voice, with italics to indicate the weight to be given to particular words, as in the arch emphasis on very at the appearance of the White Rabbit that I quoted at the start. Nothing so very remarkable in that, nor did Alice think it so very much out of the way to hear the rabbit say to itself. The tone he generates is of a story being told or a conversation taking place now between writer and reader, though, of course, it's describing events that have already taken place and that in the magic of narrative are taking place here, again, now. Some of the more remarkable effects in Alice are now quite customary in our experience 150-odd years later. For instance, the elision and flow from one scene into the next, queen into sheep, shop into river, I think corresponds to the editing processes of cinema quite as much as to the motions of dream. And then our familiarity with slow motion photography may make Alice's leisurely fall into the underworld rather less astonishing, though the alternatives suggested by the narrator offer the deep absurdity of the choice that is no choice. Either the well was very deep, or she fell very slowly, for she had plenty of time as she went down to look about her. A body falling down a well, however deep, is rarely leisurely. The punctuating events of Alice's fall retain their homely charm, their appetite, their ethics, their disappointment, their good management. She took down a jar from one of the shelves as she passed it. It was labelled orange marmalade, but to her great disappointment, it was empty. She didn't like to drop the jar for fear of killing someone underneath, so managed to put it in one of the cupboards as she fell past it. Things retain their lethal weight in motion even while Alice floats. Gravity here is erratic in its action. And I think there's probably, too, a gleam of John Stuart Mill's discussion of how preconceived opinion rules out direct observation. Mill cites Whewell on what Mill calls the imaginary laws of nature that have continued to be received as real merely because no person has steadily looked at facts which almost everyone has the opportunity of observing. And he quotes Whewell as saying, "A vague and loose mode of looking at facts very easily observable left men for a long time under the belief that a body 10 times as heavy as another falls 10 times as fast." I think Lewis Carroll is making fast and loose with all the implications of this debate. Alice must be 10 times as heavy as an empty jar of jam, but in this instance, she dawdles through the air while the jar threatens to plummet, reversing the usual error. Carroll, who read Mill's system of logic assiduously, probably also enjoyed Mill's comic account in the previous paragraph of the arguments around Copernicus's view that the Earth turned round the sun. Copernicus's supporters fell into parallel argumentative traps alongside their opponents. Mill writes, "The opponents of Copernicus argued that the Earth did not move, because if it did, a stone let fall from the top of a high tower would not reach the ground at the foot of the tower, but at a little distance from it, in a contrary direction to the Earth's course. In the same manner, said they, as if a ball is let drop from the masthead while the ship is in full sail, it does not fall exactly at the foot of the mast, but nearer to the stern of the vessel." Mill comments with exasperation, "The Copernicans could have silenced these objectors at once if they had tried dropping a ball from the masthead, since they would have found that it does fall exactly at the foot, as the theory requires. But no, they admitted the spurious fact and struggled vainly to make out a difference between the two cases." As Mill points out with some glee, the Copernicans were obliged to invoke the natural, that most slippery of categories, because they'd failed to try out what does happen when you drop a ball from a masthead. Instead, they were forced to argue like this, and this is Mill. "The ball was no part of the ship, and the motion forward was not natural, either to the ship or to the ball. The stone, on the other hand, let fall from the top of the tower, was a part of the earth, and therefore the annular revolutions which were natural to the earth were also natural to the stone. The stone would therefore retain the same motion with the tower and strike the ground precisely at the bottom of it." I think you can begin to see some of the materials which delighted Lewis Carroll and from which he could make the high spirits, the nonsense, because these contorted and Elysian explanations suggest how close a butting is nonsense and reason when observation is lacking. They chime, too, with the wonderful literalism of Carroll's characters. Laws of motion had for the Victorians again become one of the most controversial aspects of time. And I'll dwell for a moment on the Hatters' Tea Party, because that's the great moment when Carroll combines the two. Time, it turns out, can be an active participant in the narrative as well as a condition of being alive. The great set-piece discussion of time and all its wrinkles is the capital T Party or the Tea Party. And the argument jumps up a notch from lowercase to uppercase T once the Hatter claims that time is an ally of his. The move occurs when Alice is exasperated by the riddle without an answer. Why is a raven like a writing desk? The lack of an answer infringes all the rules of game time, so dear to Victorian middle-class culture. Riddles rely on the pleasurable disappointment when the ingenious but usually inadequate answer is reached among the universe of possibilities. Here instead, nullity is all that occurs, no implosion or explosion of senses. Such a riddle also lacks closure. It ebbs discomfortingly outward through time without stop. The question is launched, no answer responds, boundaries vanish, time is stayed but trickles pointlessly. And Samuel Beckett knows all about this peculiar time effect in his stage dialogue. Susan Stewart in Nonsense makes a related observation about puns, where she says that puns are terrible or awful because they split the flow of events in time. But puns, unlike answerless riddles, proliferate, though they clearly can lead to dead ends. And Stewart says that conversations in Alice are continually halted by puns, by a splitting of the discourse into two simultaneous and disparate paths, each followed by a respective member of the conversation. In a way, this doesn't sound to me like a halt, because it leads rather to proliferation, to two simultaneous and disparate paths. The puns in Alice lead directly, of course, into Finnegan's Wake. For instance, though Wonderlawn's lost to us forever, Alice, alas, she broke the glass. Little looker through the leafery, ours is a mystery of pain. Well, I won't even attempt to give you all the puns that are pressed together in that couple of lines. For Alice herself, though, in Wonderland, the riddles without an answer just lead into pure frustration. Alice sighed wearily. I think you might do something better with the time, she said, than wasting it in asking riddles that have no answers. If you knew time as well as I do, said the Hatter, you wouldn't talk about wasting it. It's him. I don't know what you mean, said Alice. Of course you don't, the Hatter said, tossing his head contemptuously. I dare say you never even spoke to time. Perhaps not, Alice cautiously replied, but I know I have to beat time when I learn music. Ah, that accounts for it, said the Hatter. He won't stand beating. Personification scoops victory in the argument. Time, the Hatter claims, will work with you if you appreciate him. He will leap from 9 in the morning to dinner time. For instance, says the Hatter, suppose it were 9 o'clock in the morning, just time to begin lessons. You'd only have to whisper a hint to time, and round goes the clock in a twinkling. 1:30, time for dinner. But it turns out that the Hatter has no such facility. On the contrary, he has quarrelled with time, and now they're stuck. It's always 6 o'clock now, he moans. It's always tea time, and we've no time to wash the things between whiles. Then you keep moving round, I suppose, said Alice. Instead of time moving, they must move round the table as if on a clock face. And Alice, of course, very soon ends up with the March Hare's dirty tea things in front of her. The scene is tolerable, not too anxiety-making, I think, because tea time is not an instant, but a period. The participants at the tea party can continue their own lives and conversations within the arrested time. 6 o'clock is understood here as tea time, not as the moment of 6 p.m., another example of time contracting and expanding. And of course, the Hatter's watch, in fact, tells, we're told, the day of the month and doesn't tell what o'clock it is. Lots of watches now do tell the day of the month, but most of them do tell what o'clock it is too. But of course, his anyhow is 2 days out because it's being polluted by butter, the best butter, and a certain number of crumbs. Now, the question of that table on which they're just going round and round, unable to leave, and unable ever to wash up, they claim, is, I think, related to another issue that was concerning mathematicians very much at the time. And that's the question of the continuity of motion through time, which, of course, famously has been a conundrum for mathematicians from Zeno's paradox of the arrow in flight onwards. Now, during the 1860s and 1870s, it was being approached by George Cantor with his theory of infinite sets. To move, an object must go to another place. We all agree. Yet at each instant, the arrow is motionless. So can motion be continuous? That depends on space being infinitely divisible. And it's an issue that Lewis Carroll returns to much later on in his essay for the psychological journal Mind called Achilles and the Tortoise. Only a very few years later than the Alice books, in 1874, Cantor argued in his theory of sets that there are degrees of infinity, even infinite infinities, and for mathematicians this eased the paradox of the continuity or discontinuity of motion. But that teasing question of infinity or infinities is here rapidly deflected by the March Hare. Then you keep moving round, I suppose, said Alice. Exactly so, said the Hatter, as the things get used up. But what happens when you get to the beginning again? Alice ventured to ask. Suppose we change the subject, the March Hare interrupted, yawning. I'm getting tired of this. I'm not a mathematician, so that for me, as for many readers, the key image at the Hatter's tea party is of the endless tea time and the dirty cups. But Alice, you notice, can walk away. She's not imprisoned in their eternal loop. And of course it'll turn out that neither are they, because the Hatter turns up as a witness in the trial scene, and in Through the Looking Glass he reappears somewhat renamed as the Anglo-Saxon messenger Hatter, because I think it's important to emphasize that these are not systematic fictions. They are ones that are sometimes quite prodigal with explanation, sometimes extremely obscure in what they will allow you to know or not know, but they're never going to systematize, which is one of their glories. The dream tea time of the Hatter's tea party is answered at the end of the book by Alice's older sister, who tells the newly woken Alice, "It was a curious dream, dear, certainly, but now run into your tea. It's getting late." The domestic round, time as diurnal family mealtimes, prevails reassuringly at the close of Wonderland. Looking Glass is less reassuring about which actuality takes predominance over dream. Did the Red King dream it, or did Alice? Which of them was the dreamer, and which the dream? The final sentence of the book stands alone, a question addressed straight to the reader. Which do you think it was? In several ways, though, Looking Glass is less disruptive than Wonderland. The game of chess leads Alice through time and place to be a queen. Moreover, in this book, Carol combines the usual drift with a kind of prolepsis, where Alice is given some authority because she has a lot of pre-knowledge which she shares with the child reader. That is, she knows her nursery rhymes. So Humpty Dumpty, Tweedledum and Tweedledee, and the Lion and the Unicorn are all helpless in the grip of the nursery rhymes that tell their fates and foretell their fates. The words of nursery rhymes can mutate in Alice's memory, but the stories they tell are inexorable. Above all, though Alice may for a little while lose her name and then her species identity in Looking Glass Land in the wood where she encounters the fawn, and where they wander for a while in an irenic space beyond identity, still, in Looking Glass, her body remains constant. Even when the live flowers redescribe her as a wilting plant, you're beginning to fade, you know, and then one can't help one's petals getting a little untidy. Alice is adamant in her bodily stability and simply changes the subject. Now, this is in contrast to Wonderland. A more intimate, elongated time is persistently disrupted in the first book. That is, the time the body takes to grow. This is the most profound disturbance of the books. In Alice in Wonderland, Carol makes visible the hidden and unruly processes of growth that all bodies undergo and all forget. Alice grows small, then large, then small again. Parts of her body are immensely elongated. She bids farewell to her feet, realizing that she will only be able to reach them by post. And regaining her own scale means the end of the dream of Wonderland. Children are often offended by that adult remark, "How you've grown." I wonder whether it's because the remark seems condescending or whether it actually seems threatening. Growth happens uncontrollably and outside consciousness, upwards and outwards through time. In this book, Alice learns, after various mishaps and near-death experiences, to control and reverse her own growth, to put herself into an ideal functional relation with the physical world around her, and to be able to make her way into the longed-for garden. This is quite contrary to the ordinary experience of children, who are always in a world scaled for adults. Chairs loom, tables bang heads, Windows are out of reach. The child is the wrong size. Here, instead, the child heroine learns to manipulate her own growth upwards and impossibly downwards. And it's this limber ease with the body, instantaneity, instead of secret, creeping, uncontrollable expansion, that plays with our fundamental and universal experience of somatic time. The effect is exhilarating as well as threatening. It mimics the child's experience of being out of scale in the power relations of occupying space. But it also releases the child from the inexorable and sometimes painful temporal experience, the sequence that leads towards adult full growth. Unmentioned, waiting, pushed away, beneath the books, is the prospect of puberty. Alice is 7 in Wonderland, 7.5 exactually, as she puts it, 7 years later in Looking Glass. She's securely in the midst of childhood. Indeed, since the oncoming of the menarche is the end of a long process of preparation for puberty, she's towards the end of the phase of childhood that is still untroubled by such irreversible change. In Looking Glass, her relation to her dream experience is directly shifting already. This is no longer totally helpless immersion, but with the willed trigger of let's pretend. That foolish time that seemed as if it would last forever, I come to my conclusion, was the time of the young Charles Dodson's infatuation with childhood as a form of eternity, as well as with particular children. Particular children grow up and cease to be children. It's happened to us all. It's an amazing thought, isn't it, that we all were. I could be addressing a room full of 7-year-olds like Alice, and we would all look different, and we've all grown, and none of us will be able to remember that process, as it were, from within, though we may remember the pains that sometimes come when the body is growing inordinately. I think this is one reason why these books, probably the founding reason, not the only one, but the founding reason why they have this strange grip on us imaginatively. Photographs seize lived moments and still them. In the Alice books, in contrast, childhood is released from single time, allowed to play anew. Lewis Carroll eased many time boundaries in the Alice books, sometimes to troubling effect. The eternities he uncovered in Alice were not eventless extensions. Instead, he explored the Gideon vacillations that time performs within us and within our universe, and the theatrical encounters of the individual with the bruising, solid, material world so deep, steeped in time, congealed and evanescent. And beyond both those presses the question of what happens next. The introductory poem of Wonderland remembers the work's genesis and the puzzles of time passing. Carroll recalls the strain of storytelling. And ever as the story drained the wells of fancy dry, and faintly strove the weary one to put the subject by, the rest next time. It is next time, the happy voices cry. The present gobbles up the future, backwards in a trice. Or, more darkly within the work. First, however, she waited for a few minutes to see if she was going to shrink any further. She felt a little nervous about this, for it might end, said Alice to herself, in my going out altogether, like a candle. I wonder what I should be like then. And she tried to fancy what the flame of a candle looks like after the candle is blown out, for she could not remember ever having seen such a thing. These books figure that flame, a flame that survives the dousing of candle after candle, breath after breath, reader after reader, a flame still in the 21st century. Or, as Heraclitus long ago put it in the 94th fragment, time is a child moving counters in a game. The royal power is a child's. Thank you. The comment is that in Dali's illustration, it looks as though she has a woman's body, and I think that's true. Sometimes, though, when she's down in the corner like this, you'll see a little girl leaping and dancing. But I think he is getting that sense that in Alice there is a sort of bulging across time sometimes, that she's very willing to play the adult as well as to be the little girl. And I think this is something that Lewis Carroll also plays upon. I mentioned that right at the beginning, that I think it's adults who assume that they are always the adults and children are always the powerless ones, whereas she becomes the powerful one who's faced with anarchy. The adult world is anarchic, and she's the only one who can keep order in one sense, but none of them, of course, will acknowledge that. They are all these violent images, the Queen, the Red Queen, and so on. But no, it's interesting that he does that. It also pulls up the eroticism of the books as well.
Thank you so much. As you were speaking, especially towards the end, about the child always being the wrong size in the wrong place, and that there's so much imagery in these books about that sense of dislocation. And I'm wondering about your response to reading these books through the image of serious illness, that in illness often one has the sense of being absolutely out of body, in the wrong place, in the wrong time, bumping into things. I mean, it's a very similar set of experiential images, as well as playing upon our disrupted senses of time, obviously mortality, but
Yes.
time in serious illness is not like other kinds of time. So I'd be very interested to hear your response to
Rather
that.
like Virginia Woolf on Being Ill, that essay, which absolutely captures that experience. I can't quite place it in relation to, directly in relation to either Dodson or Alice, in that the Alice that we meet in the books is this puzzled but competent child who is always willing to ask awkward questions and who's also adamant. She won't be browbeaten. And so I don't see her, and perhaps it wasn't she you were meaning when you were talking about serious illness as the means of, as it were, dream-making. Dodson himself, very late in his life, experienced an episode of petit mal and may have had some, he probably had migraine, and he may possibly have had some mild, it's not quite clear. It is just a single episode, so it's a bit difficult to go back through there. But I've been editing his poems for Penguin. Let me tell you, it's coming out in November, and I have so enjoyed doing it, gathering them together. And what comes out of his early poetry, because there's this child, 12, 13, 14, already writing for his little brothers and sisters, brilliant poems, very, very picked and exact, and totally anarchic. They're called useful and instructive poetry, and they run right against the grain of all that you might expect useful and instructive poetry to be. And I'm just thinking about the amount of cheerful violence that there is in those poems, as there is in the Alice books as well. Something close to pantomime violence in that people don't die of it, but perhaps there is that feeling of things being out of kilter all the time. And yes, thank you. It's an interesting thought. I must think further with it.
The character of the Red Queen, England had at the time a real queen. Was it perceived to be a parody of some sort of power, or women in power, or something like that?
Well, of course, there are the two queens. There's the Red Queen, who is very violent and powerful, and then the White Queen, who's a bit insipid and floppy. When he was commenting on the books much later on, about 20 years after he'd written them, he said that he wanted in the Red Queen to represent a sort of pointless violence. I can't think of his exact word, but it's a violence which is out of scale, out of kilter, uncontrollable. But of course it is actually controlled, because though she wants all these people to have their heads chopped off or whatever, nobody ever gets killed. Nothing ever happens. And the more insidious dangers of the books are not really located in either of the queens, I think. They're quite often in the poems, because the poems are held apart, and there you do get violence, for instance. But, I mean, she's a split person, the Red Queen and the White Queen. It's certainly true that the kings are either asleep or trailing in the rear. It's the women who are the dynamic presences in these books, all the way through, and Alice herself, of course, being the key stalwart. Yeah. Hi.
This is marvelous. I'm thinking a little bit more about the illness and dislocation imagery in reference not only to time but to space, because so much of what you're discussing seems to be Alice in space-time, and in a peculiar set of spatio-temporal crises that intensify over the course of the 19th century. You mentioned, of course, the railway journey, but there are so many other examples in which the problem of the coordination, so that the crisis is not only the one of epigenetic maturation or of illness that is somatized to an individual body, but to an entire social continuum in which everything seems to be out of whack. And there's these desperate desires, and hence, so that the crisis in the Euclidean world is, there's this, with the enormous proliferation, of course, of information and modeling and so forth, there's that simultaneous complementary dream for, as in The Hunting of the Snark, for the perfect chart, right, the absolute blank. But that's not a solution either, so that this becomes a kind of traveling in every, it would seem, in every major crisis of the coordination of space and time in the epic, perhaps?
Yes, I mean, you put it beautifully. And these are picaresque novels. I think that's important too, that people sometimes complain that they don't have a plot. What they have are these multiple systems which won't quite fit each other. And you have Alice going on to the next adventure. The word suddenly, I did a little count recently, the number of times that she's got out of some dilemma simply by the word suddenly occurring, and then she shoots off at a different angle, or you turn the page. So I think that it's that sense of the impossible. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm causing damage to your lights. It's the impossibility of putting together all the different forms of time and space and social action that he is figuring. I mean, it connects to the question that Panine was asking about parody. I don't think the books are strongly parodic of particular people, but I think it's much more this exploration of impossible adhesions. I think I'd want to put it.
I mean, and that speaks also to the question, as you asked, about royal sovereignty and why that's so important, because this is a period, right, of staggering dislocation in which the symbolic importance of the monarchy becomes ever greater as a way, not just of imagining stability, and of course, Conrad has so much fun with this in The Secret Agent and the question of the Royal Observatory, but of one thing through which everything else can be measured, because there seems to be no similar Archimedean point. And so in that sense, the books, I thought, as you were speaking, seem to prophesize the famous headline in the Times of London when Einstein is finally published. The headline, I think, was "Newtonian Ideas Overthrown." And so royalty, as we see, which is becomes the only thing against which we can measure. I mean, going back to Charles I or something like that, it's the only thing against we can measure all this impossible perturbations as everything that is solid melts into air.
And it both goes back to the figuration that children have of themselves as kings and queens, that sense of their being in power and yet also acknowledging their own powerlessness. But when one looks at the dates of their making, 1860 is when Queen Victoria begins to withdraw into her long mourning. So she's both there and not there. She is the figuration of authority, and yet she has vanished. Fine. Okay.
Please join me in thanking Dame Beer again and join us downstairs for a reception.